For almost as long as Yu-Gi-Oh! Has existed as a game, so has Mind Crush. The card was originally released as a short print in 2004's Soul of the Duelist, and in today's video, I'm going to talk about why I like Mind Crush so much. Not only is it an incredibly versatile card that has been very popular in sideboards and main boards in a variety of formats, but it's a card that shows a lot of obscure rulings that actually tend to come up in today's metagame, and I think by understanding the rulings and the reasoning behind a card like Mind Crush, you can better understand when new cards come out, how they interact with each other in these sort of niche scenarios. Anyway though, let's read Mind Crush and talk about what it does and how it's affected the metagame and how it's gotten better over time. This card only gets stronger as we get more and more search cards, but it's a card out there that actually rewards smart players, and I think that's always worth mentioning. While cards like Regeki have incredibly limited uses, yeah, you can use them for like tempo gains, but for the most part, you're going to Regeki a full board at every opportunity. A card like Mind Crush, as a contrast, actually rewards someone for knowing their opponent's entire deck, the ins and outs of it, all the combos, and when to Mind Crush to get the most value out of the card. Anyway, what does Mind Crush do? It's a trap card, a normal trap card that says declare one card name. If that card is in your opponent's hand, they must discard all copies of it, otherwise you discard one random card. Now there's a lot of things going on here, but the basic use of Mind Crush and the most conventional use is when you Mind Crush a card that your opponent just searched. Say your opponent activates Reinforcements of the Army to add Marauding Captain to their hand, you can instantly flip up the Mind Crush. You don't have to play any guessing games. You know that you'll hit at least one copy of Marauding Captain, potentially up to 3 copies though, and I think that that's really cool. And that's the most conventional use for this card, but there are tons of other uses that have popped up in particular metagames. I think one of the most interesting uses is when this card was played in Nekroz format. Obviously, it was played as a counter to all of the search cards in Nekroz, but one of the cooler ways you could use this is that if your opponent was trying to summon Nekroz of Trishula and they activated Nekroz Mirror, you could chain Mind Crush calling Trishula, and this would put your opponent in a weird spot, and this kind of brings us to the first ruling that Mind Crush helps deal with. So if you chain Mind Crush to a Nekroz Mirror calling Trishula, your opponent does have to discard the Trishula. Here's the thing though, because they activated Nekroz Mirror, they have to attempt to resolve the card, and what that means is that if they had a Nekroz in hand that they weren't planning on summoning, as long as they can meet the requirements, not if they want to meet the requirements, but as long as they can meet the requirements, they are forced into ritual summoning that monster. But what's super cool, and what comes up sometimes in some other examples that I'll talk about, is that if your opponent doesn't have a card in hand that meets the requirements, they have to reveal their entire hand to you. Now this proves that they have nothing in hand to meet the requirements, and that's not written anywhere explicitly on the Mind Crush. Now where does this come up with other examples? I think the most notable modern example of this is that if you're let's say you're playing against Invoked, they summon Alistair, they search Invocation, and then they activate the Invocation. Now Invocation can either send cards from your hand to the graveyard, or it can banish cards from your graveyard and field to perform the fusion summon. But what if you chain Artifact Lancia to Invocation? Well, a couple things happen, but one of the things that happens is exactly what I just described with Mind Crush and Nekroz Mirror. If your opponent does not have a suitable amount of fusion materials in their hand for the Invocation, they have to reveal their entire hand to you, and in many cases that is actually the case, because for them to resolve that fusion summon card when you've Lancia'd them, that would require them to have a particular attribute of monster in their hand, as well as a second copy of Alistair. Many times that simply doesn't happen, which means that the Invocation just kind of fizzles. This isn't written on Mind Crush anywhere, it's just how the game works, and it comes up in all sorts of places. I just wanted to list one other example and kind of show that Mind Crush was an early example of how these interactions actually play out in actual Yu-Gi-Oh! Beyond that though, there's actually another hidden, non-written ruling that Mind Crush sort of exemplifies that goes with a ton of other cards, even more so than the one that I just described. So to activate Mind Crush, even though it technically does not say it on here, you do have to have a card in hand, and that is the case even if you know 100% that the card you're calling is in your opponent's hand. You still have to have a card in your hand just in case you miss it. Now, what does this tell us about the game? Well, this teaches a new player or an intermediate player that you can't activate card effects unless you can resolve at the moment of activation every single part of that card's effect. And that might seem silly, but there are cards out there that your opponent could chain and they special summon the card from the hand that you know is in there, and that creates a situation where now, okay, you have to discard a card, but oh wait, you can't. And this teaches us a lot about plenty of other cards. I think the most popular example that I can think of is the Lightsworn Lumina card. Lumina has to have a target in graveyard before you activate its effect, even if you're bringing back the card that you're discarding. What does this mean? This means that you have to have a Lightsworn engraved, even if it's not the Lightsworn that you want to summon, and this is just how the game works. This is so helpful. You can't activate cards that you can't resolve, and that teaches you so many different rulings. Even if a card's cost would then help you meet the activation target for it, you can't even attempt to use it, and that's really interesting. And once again, Mind Crush is a perfect example of how this can transcend not only this one trap card, but go into a ton of different cards, and that's pretty crazy considering that these two rulings are still being applied to plenty of modern cards, and this is coming all from a card release in 2004. Now, beyond those rulings, Mind Crush is super interesting as well because, like I said, it rewards smart players that know their opponent's decks. I've already talked about the most common use of Mind Crush when your opponent searches a card, you hitting it out of their hand. I've already talked about one sort of fringe use of hitting a card that your opponent was trying to ritual summon, but there's plenty of other scenarios where Mind Crush has actually been used to sort of outplay the opponent in ways that you wouldn't think. Let's say it's your turn and it's your main phase 2 and your opponent randomly discards an effect failure out of their hand. That seems pretty weird because the monster they're hitting on your side of the field wasn't even activating effect, but you check their graveyard and notice that they now have one light monster and one dark monster in their graveyard. You think that's kind of curious, so you set Mind Crush and pass, so when your opponent goes to their standby phase, you flip the Mind Crush and call Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning, hitting it out of their hand. Now in that scenario, your opponent didn't technically reveal the fact that they had a Blackluster Soldier in hand, but you could guess from the context clues that that's what they were setting up. That's super interesting, but what if we take it a step further and say your opponent knew that you had a Mind Crush, let's say you added it off of the duality, and they figured that you would then predict that they had a BLS in hand, but they don't have a BLS in hand, and they're now forcing you to discard a random card in your hand. In that case, they actually went one step further and completely outplayed you, even though up until that point you thought you were outplaying them. That's the kind of intellectual gameplay that really enhances a card game, and that's one of the many reasons that I like Mind Crush. It just continuously awards the better player and puts certain players in positions where they simply can't outplay their opponent because they weren't thinking far enough in advance, and there aren't a ton of cards like that in Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Definitely isn't a super straightforward game. There's tons of complicated interactions, but Mind Crush as a single card that's not an archetype card, it's not an aggressive card, just allows for so much variety in gameplay. That's super interesting. And just to go off of one other ruling that Mind Crush sort of helps, I don't know if it helps set that ruling in place, but it definitely comes up a lot. Mind Crush teaches us that when we are declaring card names for cards like Prohibition and Mind Crush and DD Designator, anything where you have to declare a card name, you don't actually have to, and this might surprise you, you don't actually have to name the official full name of that card. You just have to name something that removes any reasonable doubt of what it is. What I mean by this is that you can simply call the race car Geargia monster in your opponent's hand, and if you can describe the card enough, that technically counts as declaring the card name. You may have not known that, but there's been tons of times in the past where opponents have tried to shark their opponents because they're like, oh, they didn't know the exact name every single. I mean, I think of like the Karakuri cards that have like like a ton of letters and numbers and weird names, and the names are like a sentence long. You don't have to know that entire card name to call it with Mind Crush. You can just sort of describe it to your opponent, describe its effects, describe its attack or defense, anything you can to make sure that your opponent has no confusion about which card you're talking about. Throughout most of this video, I've talked about different rulings that come up when you play Mind Crush, as well as some of the more interesting gameplay interactions with this card, but I think that at the end of the day, one of my favorite things about Mind Crush is what I said at the very beginning, and that's that it's always interesting when a card that is so old only sees an increased amount of play as the years go by. So few old cards are played to this day that it's really interesting when a card that's not crazy enough to be on the Forbidden and Limited list in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Stuff like Monster Reborn and Solemn Judgment, but a card that's basically been a 3 of for almost all of history. I say almost because it has been on the list way back in the day, but for almost all of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This card has been at 3 copies per deck, and it's still seen play every once in a while depending on if the format invokes for it. And I think that this card is currently being played in many Altergeist decks. It actually was in one of the Altergeist top 32 decks from YCS New Jersey in the main deck, just proving that an old card from 2004 can still see play in a modern setting, and also that it's a great example of several rulings that come up in pretty much any deck that you're going to play at a competitive level. Anyway though, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you later. Bye.